He told her she needed to move on, that her grief was making her obsessed with the stolen car. He didn't know she found the online sale listing, and the man she just called wasn't just the law. It was the only other person on earth who knew the car's VIN number by heart, because he and his best friend built it together. Have you ever poured your heart into a memory only to have it dismissed as an obsession? Have you been made to feel that your love is a burden, your grief an inconvenience? Have you ever been told to move on by the very person standing on the rubble of what they broke? This is not a channel about healing. This is a channel about holding the invoice. We are here to document the moment the bill for betrayal comes due. Stay with us and witness the full, ruinous cost of disrespect. The car was not just a car. It was a 1967 Shelby GT 500, cherry red, and it was the third person in Margaret and Frank's marriage. Frank had bought it as a shell of rust and ambition 40 years ago. He and his best friend, a young deputy named Dave Miller, had spent a decade of weekends rebuilding it from the chassis up. Margaret's son Kevin was a toddler then, playing with toy cars on the oil-stained concrete while the two men tinkered and laughed. The car became a time capsule. The faint scent of Margaret's perfume in the leather seats from their anniversary drives, the small scratch on the dashboard from the time Kevin, at 7, dropped a wrench. Every nut, every bolt, every coat of wax was a story. When Frank was diagnosed, the last thing he did before the sickness took his strength was to polish the chrome grille until it gleamed. His final lucid words to Margaret were not about the house or the savings. They were, "Take care of her, Maggie. Don't ever let her leave the family." 6 months after the funeral, the silence in the garage was a wound. Kevin, now 45 and radiating an oily sort of charm that always set Margaret on edge, approached her with a face of practiced concern. He told her the garage wasn't secure enough. He said the damp air was bad for the engine. He spoke up a professional, climate-controlled facility, a place where the car would be preserved as a long-term investment. "It's too painful for you to see it every day, Mom," he cooed, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let me handle this. Let me take this one burden off your plate." Margaret, hollowed out by grief and clinging to the belief in the fundamental goodness of her child, agreed. It was, she thought, what a mother does. She handed him the keys, the metal still feeling warm as if Frank had just set them down. She watched as he drove the cherry red ghost out of her life. That was the last time she saw it in person. A month later, she asked for the address of the storage facility. Kevin was evasive. "It's complicated, Mom. A private collector's space, very exclusive. But don't worry, it's safe." A few weeks after that, she saw pictures of him on a yacht in the Caribbean holding a glass of champagne, wearing a watch she'd never seen before, a watch that cost more than her own car. When she asked, he was dismissive. "A good investment," he said. "A client paid for the trip." But the excuses were wearing thin. The final cut came on the anniversary of Frank's passing. She had asked, softly, if Kevin could just send her a photograph of the car, just to see it. His response was a sigh, heavy with manufactured impatience. "Mom, you have to stop this. It's an object. Dad is gone. He'd want you to move on. Honestly, I think all this focus on the car, it's just your grief talking. It's not healthy." That night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat at her laptop. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was just clicking, trying to numb the fresh sting of his words. On a whim, she typed 1967 Shelby GT 500 for sale into the search bar. She scrolled past dozens of listings, and then she saw it. It was an auction site, a high-end dealer based out of state. The photos were pristine, professionally lit, but it was her car, Frank's car. She knew the faint pinstripe he had painted by hand on the glove compartment. She knew the exact grain of the wooden steering wheel he had spent a month restoring. She saw it all with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins. And below the gallery of photos, in bold green letters, were two words that stopped her heart. Sold. $250,000.
There was no scream, no gasp. Margaret stared at the glowing green letters on the screen, and the chaotic storm of grief in her heart finally froze over, becoming something hard, clear, and perfectly still. The sale price, $250,000, was not just a number, it was a receipt, a detailed invoice for the final, absolute value of her son's love. She took a deep, steadying breath. With methodical precision, she moved the cursor, taking a screenshot of the auction page, capturing the pictures, the sale price, and the dealer's information. She saved the file to her desktop, not in a folder named Kevin or Betrayal, but in one she created just for this moment. It was labeled simply Evidence. Then she picked up her phone. She didn't scroll to her son's name. She went to the letter D and found the entry for Dave Miller. The name was followed by a single powerful word. Sheriff. She pressed the call button. "Dave," she said, her voice betraying no emotion at all. "It's Margaret White. I need to see you. It's about Frank's car." An hour later, she was sitting in a visitor's chair in the county sheriff's office. The room smelled of coffee and bureaucracy, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of sympathy she had grown so used to. Dave Miller, his uniform crisp, his face etched with the familiar lines of concern he reserved for old friends, sat opposite her. "Maggie, what's this about? Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and kind. She didn't answer. Instead, she slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. It was the printout from the auction site. He picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "A '67 Shelby. Nice. Looks just like Frank's." He smiled, a sad, nostalgic smile. "They don't make them like that anymore." "They don't," Margaret agreed softly. "Look at the photo of the interior, Dave. At the pinstripe on the glove box." He squinted, then his eyes widened slightly. "I remember that. Frank used my daughter's nail polish brush to get it just right, said a real brush was too thick." His voice trailed off as a dawning horror began to crawl across his features. He looked from the photo back to Margaret's icily calm face. "Maggie, what is this?" "Kevin told me he was putting it in a climate-controlled storage facility for safekeeping. He said my grief was making me unwell. He sold it 3 weeks ago. The money, I assume, paid for his new watch and his trip to the Caribbean." Dave leaned back, the color draining from his face. The air in the room went from friendly concern to stunned silence. For a moment, he was not a sheriff. He was just Frank's friend, absorbing a betrayal that felt like a punch to his own gut. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "There has to be some mistake, a misunderstanding. Kevin loved your husband." "He loved what your husband left behind," Margaret corrected, her voice now sharp with a surgeon's precision. She leaned forward. "Vehicle identification number, Dave. He made me memorize it. Did he ever tell it to you?" "F7R02Q," Dave began, the numbers tumbling out from a dusty corner of his memory. "1826769, Margaret finished without blinking. "It's listed right there at the bottom of the page, under lot details." Dave's eyes scanned the paper, and whatever professional restraint he possessed finally shattered. He slammed a printout down on his desk, his face a mask of cold fury. The friend was gone. The sheriff was here. That boy, he seethed, the words low and dangerous. He didn't just sell a car, Maggie. He sold a piece of his father's soul for a plane ticket. He looked at her, his eyes now blazing with righteous anger, an anger she herself had suppressed in favor of cold strategy. "This isn't a family dispute," he said, his voice dropping into an official register. "This is ground theft auto, misappropriation of an estate asset. That's a felony, a serious one." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, composing himself. When he turned around, his plan was set. "I am going to make 2 calls. The first is to the dealer who auctioned this car, to officially request the seller's information on file. The second is to Kevin, a preliminary inquiry, official business." She drove home in silence, parked her modest sedan in the garage, and walked into the quiet house. She sat down in Frank's favorite armchair, the one facing the window, and waited. Less than an hour passed before her phone, sitting on the end table beside her, lit up. The screen displayed a single frantic text message. It was from Kevin. It read, "Mom, the sheriff just called me about Dave's car. What did you tell him?"
Margaret let the phone buzz. She didn't pick it up. She watched the screen as a series of new messages flooded in, each one more frantic than the last. "It was a misunderstanding. You shouldn't have bothered the sheriff with family business. Call me." She observed the digital panic with the detached interest of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction. His predictable, self-serving narrative had just collided with an undeniable external authority, and it was crumbling. When the house phone began to ring, she let it go to voicemail. She already knew what she would hear. Kevin's voice, a slick blend of feigned concern and rising anger, painting himself as the victim. It was an old, tired script, one she had politely tolerated for decades. That evening, Kevin's new girlfriend, a woman named Tiffany, who was 20 years his junior and had the hungry eyes of a person who measures love by carat weight, posted a story on her Instagram. It was a teary-eyed selfie, artfully composed to highlight both her distress and the diamond bracelet Kevin had recently given her. The caption was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. "So heartbroken to see my incredible partner being attacked by his own family. All he ever wanted was to help his mother move on from her grief, and this is the thanks he gets. Some people just can't stand to see others happy." The post was followed by a flood of sympathetic comments from Tiffany's equally vacuous friends, all offering prayers and condemning the toxic and ungrateful mother. Kevin's older sister, Caroline, who had always resented Margaret for her close relationship with Frank, shared the post to her own Facebook page with a single sanctimonious comment. "This is what we've been dealing with for years. So sad." Margaret, sitting in the quiet of her study, watched the public frame job unfold. It didn't hurt. It clarified. They were trying to build a narrative of her as a hysterical, grieving widow, an unstable woman lashing out. They thought they were fighting a war of emotion. They had no idea they were in a war of evidence. She turned to the man sitting in the armchair opposite her, Sheriff Dave Miller, now out of uniform and looking more like the friend who had helped build a car than the lawman who was about to dismantle a life. He had a printed stack of papers on his lap. He gestured to her laptop screen, his face a grim mask of disgust. "They're painting you as a villain, Maggie. Standard playbook for the guilty. Muddy the waters." "Let 'em," Margaret said, her voice quiet. "They're playing checkers. We are playing chess." Dave picked up the top sheet from his stack.
He said the dealer faxed over the signed consignment agreement. Kevin declared himself the sole legal owner of the vehicle, signed it 3 weeks ago, also provided a sworn affidavit that the title was lost, so a new one was issued. That's a second felony, by the way, falsifying a legal document. He then held up a second document. This is a copy of the wire transfer from the dealership to his personal investment account. $250,000. 2 days later, he wired $50,000 from that account to a jeweler in New York. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the screen where Tiffany was now posting a memory of her unforgettable Caribbean vacation. Caroline knows about the money, Margaret said, more as a statement than a question. That's why she's defending him so loudly. He paid off her credit card debt. Dave stared at her. How did you know that? Frank's will, Margaret said simply. The one you witnessed. The car wasn't Kevin's to sell. It was never even meant for him. It was bequeathed to Frank's grandson, to Caroline's son. Kevin sold his own nephew's inheritance to buy his girlfriend a bracelet and pay off his sister's shopping bills. A heavy silence descended upon the room, thick with the weight of this final devastating revelation. Dave leaned back, looking at Margaret with a new sense of awe. She had not only uncovered a theft, she had uncovered a conspiracy. It's time, Maggie, Dave said, his voice firm. He picked up his phone. Who are you calling? The nephew. Young man has the right to know what's been stolen from him, and since his mother is an accomplice to the crime, it falls to me to inform the victim. After that, I'm going to have a little chat with my friend over at the county prosecutor's office. Margaret leaned back in her chair and finally allowed herself a small, cold, satisfying smile. The war for the narrative was over. She hadn't needed to post a single comment. She had simply forwarded one undeniable piece of paper, Frank's last will and testament, to the one person whose inheritance had just been embezzled. The court of public opinion was about to be overruled by a court of law.
The first crack in their fortress appeared not as a cannon blast, but as a quiet, panicked phone call. Caroline, her voice shrill with disbelief, called Margaret 2 days later. "What have you done?" she shrieked without preamble. "My son just got a call from a lawyer. Some nonsense about Grandpa's car. You need to call this off, Mother. You are tearing this family apart over a stupid old car." "The car was his inheritance, Caroline," Margaret replied, her voice as calm and unyielding as a river stone. "A fact you seem to have forgotten when you accepted a $30,000 payoff to look the other way." The silence on the other end of the line was more damning than any confession. Caroline stuttered, stammered, then hung up. That was the last Margaret heard from her sister-in-law directly. The public defense of her wonderful brother on Facebook ceased immediately. The second assault was a direct appeal for pity, and it came from Kevin. He appeared at her doorstep, unannounced. His face pale and puffy, the confident, slick veneer had been stripped away, leaving behind the weak, desperate man she'd always known was underneath. "Mom, please," he began, trying to step inside. She blocked the doorway. "This has gone too far. It was a business decision, a poor one maybe, but I was going to pay it all back, with interest. The market was just about to turn." "The market for what, Kevin?" Margaret asked, her voice laced with ice. "A girlfriend's jewelry? Did you have a 10-year plan to repay your nephew for the $250,000 asset you stole from him?" He flinched as if struck. "It's not stealing if it's family. You can't do this to me. I'll lose everything." He tried to play his final, most pathetic card. "What would Dad think?" "I imagine Dad would think his best friend, the sheriff of this county, is doing his job," Margaret said, her gaze unwavering, "and that his wife is finally doing hers. Now, I suggest you get a lawyer. Goodbye, Kevin." She closed the door on his open-mouthed shock. The soft click of the deadbolt echoed like a gavel. The final, most depraved gambit came from Tiffany. This was the attack Margaret had been waiting for, the one she knew would be the ugliest. An anonymous email arrived in her inbox. It contained a single, blurry photo of Margaret in her garden, taken from a distance through the trees. The subject line read, "A confused old woman all alone." The body of the email was simple. "Your son loves you. He's worried you're not well. Drop the charges. He just wants to take care of his mother." It was a clumsy, thuggish threat, meant to make her feel vulnerable, isolated, and afraid. It had the opposite effect. It was the last piece of evidence she needed. She didn't delete the email. She forwarded it without comment to one person, Sheriff Dave Miller. The subject line she added was her own: witness intimidation. Dave called her less than 10 minutes later. His voice was no longer just angry. It was cold, official, and utterly devoid of any remaining sentiment. "Maggie," he said, his tone clipped, "that's it. That's the end of the line. The DA just got everything he needs to add a felony charge of witness tampering to his growing list. And as for his charming girlfriend, sending a threatening communication is its own special kind of crime. I'm dispatching a deputy to have a chat with her right now." Margaret had anticipated their moves, their lies, their desperation. She had built a fortress of truth, and each of their pathetic attacks had simply bounced off, leaving them more exposed than before. She had laid the trap, and they had walked into it, one by one, blinded by their own arrogance and greed. Each of their desperate attempts to paint her as weak had only served to prove her strength. Each attempt to silence her had only amplified the evidence against them. I thought they were laying a siege, but all they had done was hand her more ammunition.
The final reckoning took place not in a courtroom, but in the sterile, quiet atmosphere of a lawyer's conference room. The meeting was ostensibly for a pretrial deposition, but Margaret knew it was a surrender. Kevin was there, looking hollowed out, his expensive suit now seeming to hang off his frame. His lawyer, a harried-looking man who clearly knew he was defending a lost cause, sat beside him. Caroline was not present. Tiffany was not present. They had both, Margaret had learned, accepted plea bargains in exchange for their testimony against the man they had so publicly championed. Margaret sat on the opposite side of the polished mahogany table. Next to her was not Dave Miller, but the county's lead prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright. On the table in front of Miss Albright was a single, thick file. The file labeled evidence. Kevin wouldn't look at her. He stared at the wood grain of the table as if it held the secrets to his salvation. His lawyer cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to make restitution," he began, his voice weak. "He is willing to return the full amount of the sale and to cover all legal fees in exchange for all charges being dropped." Miss Albright let the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before she responded. She didn't even open the file. "Restitution is not on the table," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We are well beyond that. Your client committed felony grand theft. He committed felony document fraud by faking a lost title. He then, with the help of an accomplice, attempted to intimidate the primary witness, his own mother. The car, by the way, has been recovered. The new owner was more than happy to cooperate once he learned he'd purchased stolen property. It is currently in a county impound lot, where it will be held as evidence until it is released to its rightful owner, Mr. Frank White's grandson." Kevin visibly flinched at the mention of the impound lot, a place of grime and indifference, a world away from the climate-controlled fantasy he'd spun. "Your client," Miss Albright continued, her gaze fixed on Kevin's lawyer, but her words aimed directly at Kevin, "is facing a minimum of 5 to 7 years in state prison. Given the premeditated nature of the crime and the subsequent attempts to obstruct justice, I am confident we will secure a conviction for the maximum sentence." Kevin finally looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, dawning terror. He turned to Margaret, his last pathetic shield. "Mom, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm your son." Margaret met his gaze. The well of her pity had run dry weeks ago. All that was left was the cold, hard bedrock of truth. Frank's son would have honored his father's last wish. Frank's son would not have sold his nephew's birthright for a trinket and a vacation. I don't know who you are, but you are not his son. With that, she stood up. Miss Albright closed her file with a soft, final thud. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room, a full stop on Kevin's life as he knew it. As Margaret walked towards the door, she heard a single wretched sound behind her, a choked sob from the man who had called her a confused old woman. It was the sound of a bill long overdue, finally being paid in full. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her grandson. "Just got off the phone with the DA. They said Grandpa's car is safe. Thank you, Grandma. I love you." Margaret stopped in the hallway, her back to the conference room door. She closed her eyes for a moment, then typed a single, simple reply. "He loved you too. It's all yours now." She deleted Kevin's contact from her phone, then walked out of the building and into the clean, quiet afternoon, leaving the rubble of her son's life behind her.
The newspapers reported the outcome in a few brief, dispassionate paragraphs in the local section. Local businessman sentenced for fraud. Grand theft auto. The article mentioned the theft of a vintage automobile and the misappropriation of an estate asset. It quoted the prosecutor on the seriousness of witness intimidation. It did not mention love or betrayal or the memory of a man polishing the chrome grille of his cherry-red pride and joy. It was just a story about a crime. For the rest of the world, it was already old news. For Margaret, it was the beginning of a quiet shore. The silence in her house no longer felt like a wound. It felt like peace. The garage, however, remained a place of gentle ghosts. The empty space where the Shelby had sat for 40 years held a powerful presence. It was not a space she could simply fill with a new car or garden tools. It needed a new purpose. Her grandson, a good-hearted young man of 19 with Frank's kind eyes, came to her a few weeks after the car was officially released from the impound lot. He sat with her at the kitchen table, turning a set of keys over and over in his hands. "Grandma," he said, his voice full of a respectful hesitation she hadn't heard from a man in a long time. "I can't keep it. Not really." Margaret looked at him surprised. "It was your grandfather's wish, sweetheart. It's yours." "I know, and I'll cherish it forever, but it's a piece of history. It needs to be driven, taken care of in a way I'm not ready for, and it belongs here, in his garage." He pushed the keys across the table towards her. "But maybe we could take it out on weekends, together. You could tell me the stories." And so, a new routine was born. The Shelby GT500 came home, its cherry red paint gleaming under the garage lights. A prodigal son returned. The scent of leather and old polish once again filled the space. But it was no longer a static monument to a past love. Every Saturday, Margaret would find her grandson in the garage, a polishing cloth in hand, just as his grandfather had been. He'd check the oil, he'd fuss over the engine, and then he would open the passenger door for her, a small gesture of chivalry that felt both old-fashioned and brand new. They would drive the country roads, the engine rumbling with the same powerful voice Frank had loved so much. Margaret would point out the spot where they had pulled over to watch meteor shower on their 20th anniversary. She'd tell him the story of the small scratch on the dashboard, and he would laugh. In these moments, Frank was not a ghost in the passenger seat. He was a living memory, a legacy being passed down through stories and shared experience. The car was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It had become a bridge between 3 generations. One sunny afternoon, she sat on the porch while her grandson meticulously washed the car in the driveway. A familiar car pulled up to the curb. Sheriff Dave Miller, now retired, and in a comfortable flannel shirt, got out. He came and sat in the rocking chair beside her, and for a long time they just watched the boy in the car, a comfortable silence between them. "Here looks just like Frank when he does that," Dave said, his voice soft with nostalgia. "He has his hands," Margaret agreed, "and his heart." Dave nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "You know, Maggie, I've spent my life dealing with the worst parts of people. It's easy to forget how much decency there is in the world." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding respect. "What you did, it took a strength I don't think even Frank knew you had." Margaret looked out at her grandson, a young man learning to care for something precious. She looked at the cherry red car gleaming in the sun, a time capsule now humming with a new life. And she looked at the friend beside her, a good man who had chosen loyalty over convenience. She realized her life was not empty. It was simply curated. She had systematically removed the things that were false and had carefully tended to the things that were true. The process had been brutal, but the peace it had yielded was absolute. It was a peace she had earned, a peace she had built, a quiet shore, all her own.